Hi, I'm Parker Miley.
I'm Tim Benjamin.
And this is the Rage Podcast, where today we're going to discuss a very deep theological question. But before we get into that, I gotta do some explanation.
Okay? All right, explanation, please.
So I have a routine where before I go to bed, my goal is to read at least one chapter of whatever book I'm currently reading in the Bible, okay? I challenge myself. I really don't like any of the first couple Old Testament books, other than, Genesis and Exodus. Those are fairly okay.
Yeah.
But then once you get
tough ones in there.
Once you get Judges and even Samuel and Chronicles and all those can be a very kind of drawn out, okay? But so I challenged myself and I said, First Samuel's the book I'm going to start reading, and I'm going to try getting all the first and seconds done, okay?
Okay.
So as I was reading, I'm in chapter 15 right now.
Of which book?
Of First Samuel, chapter 15, verse 10. And I'm going to read the verse, and I'm going to just give a little bit of explanation of what I catch up in here, okay? So, First Samuel, chapter 15, verse 10 through... No, let's just do verse 10. Okay. The word of the Lord came to Samuel, and this is what the Lord said, okay? This is here where the question comes from. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned his back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry and cried to the Lord all night. Okay, so that I was reading that, and if you read your Bible or anything like me, I highlight and I circle. I'm like, there's a question here, and I put a little question mark beside it. And I'm like, what's going on? And for the last several years, or however long Tim has been our pastor at Wayne Street, I've been so blessed to be able to just text him at the random hours of night and saying, "Hey, what does this mean?" Yeah. I mean, I've been doing it for years. I think,
yeah, and we still hired him. Yeah, it's amazing.
I mean, I'm surprised he doesn't think I'm like some psychopath. And he's like, but it's like, he's like, "Hey, Tim, what does this mean?" Yeah. And but I mean, I do it frequently. I constantly will, ask and try to figure out some of that stuff because, I get hung up on the fact that it says, so this is the Lord talking, I regret the fact that I made Saul king, for he has not performed up to my commandments, and so forth. And that, it's just a question. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Some of us feel like, well, how can God have regret or confusion or make mistakes or whatnot? And so that's the question that I'm going to now hand over to the great and mighty Reverend Timothy James Benjamin.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so here it is. And the answer is real simple. No, God cannot make mistakes. We're just going to start there. However, that does leave us with this verse, which is very interesting, because the word is regret. Mm-hmm. Now, I think back on my life, it's actually not all that hard to regret doing the right thing. I know they say, you'll never regret doing the right thing. That's true. Always do the right thing. But I think in the midst of that, we have all come to a moment where we had to make a terrible decision, and we knew what the right thing was, but we didn't want to do it. And even leading up to it and even after it, we think, I know that was the right thing to do, but I still feel terrible about it. I've had many of those situations in my life dealing with professional and personal situations where I started looking at the situation thinking, wow, the right thing here is terrible. In fact, at this point, this thing has spiraled so far out of control that the best thing I can do is the least bad thing, which means none of the options are good. So does God regret, in this particular passage, does God regret making Saul king because it was a mistake? No, because God is incapable of mistakes, okay? But even though Saul was the right choice, and again, you go read the Old Testament, and there's plenty of evidence for us to say, really? Really the right choice, huh? Okay. But if you know the story of Saul from the Old Testament, you'll know that he gave God a pretty hard time. But for whatever reason, Saul was the right choice. So I don't want to say God was in error. At the same time, we have free will. So it wasn't like God was using Saul as a meat puppet either to do whatever he wanted, because that doesn't work either. So Saul had choices. Saul made choices God regretted, but I can't say that making him the king was God making an error, even though the way it turned out, God says, I certainly wish this would have went a different direction, which I think that's beyond debate. But I have many times in my life where I had to make a decision that I regretted having to make. In fact, even as recently as, in the last couple of days, to have decisions that I had to make, either because I was the pastor of the church or because of what was going on in my life. I knew the decision had to be made. I knew what the right thing to do was, so the decision was made, and you have to live with the consequences.
Question.
Sure.
All right. So I'm constantly trying to get questions. Okay. Like that's one of the things about learning and studying.
Yeah.
I always say you learn by asking questions.
Absolutely.
Anytime I am in a small group, or even like when I'm teaching the kids and everything, I normally always leave a chunk of time to ask questions. Okay.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to ask a question. Now, you're using, okay, you're a man, you're here on Earth, and you're using the example of you got into a situation and the best decision you could make was not the right one. How does God ever get himself into those situations, being, all knowing, all powerful, and everything else? How can God truly ever get in a situation where he's in the pinch between fighting for this way or that way, or trying to find the base level? I mean, if Saul wasn't the right choice, then what would make him from, picking a better choice than Saul or anything else?
Because, and this goes back to a debate, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, we were talking about free will? It's right back to that. If God had complete control of everything, it wouldn't matter who he picked. He could have picked a cactus to be the king, and that would have worked out if God was deciding to control everything. But because God, instead of deciding to control everything, has decided to empower things and empower people by empowering somebody, and that person has free will, and Saul made a metric ton of mistakes, and God says, well,
So God had a lot of faith in Saul in the beginning.
He obviously
and then as Saul becomes king, and actually there's a battle. They're going after. To give you a little bit of context on the rest of the verse, Saul was going into a battle, and they had to destroy an entire city, and all their cattle and oxen and everything else. He had to kill everything. Everything had to die. But what Saul did was that he took the fattiest of every animal and he sacrificed them to God. But that is not what God commanded. God commanded that all of them will die in this fiery takeover. He didn't say this animal serve for sacrificing. So Saul did not follow God's
directions.
Okay, the directions. So then that's when Saul comes to Samuel, not Saul, when God comes to Samuel and says, hey, I'm regretting the fact that I made Saul king because, he can't follow my instructions. And he goes on, and that's a very loosened reference. That
and probably for another episode sometime we could talk about the relationship between God and Samuel and what that conversation denotes about that. That'd be an interesting conversation.
But so I think it's interesting and how it uses that word regret, because I think we don't find God to be a person full of regrets.
I think I understand where you're coming from, and you're right. Okay, but I don't draw that parallel between mistakes being the only thing that leads to regret.
Well, okay, yeah, that's
a distinction I'm making. Yes, mistakes always lead to regret. However, sometimes doing the right thing still does, unbeknownst to you or out of your control. And I think that's what happened here. In fact, I think the entire... Let me think through how I'm going to say this. I think the entire gospel story, if you want to switch to the New Testament, I think in the Jesus story there's a lot of regret. I think there's a lot of time where Jesus said, I wish I hadn't come to this. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says.
Yeah, well, that's what, I mean...
Kind of wish this didn't happen this way. Your will be done, but I kind of wish this would have went a different way. To me, that's regret. That doesn't mean God made a mistake, but there were plenty of mistakes that were made by other people. I think in Saul's situation, God, did the best he could with what he had to work with, and unfortunately, the people he was hoping for more out of didn't produce. And that led to regret.
I guess that gives a big... explanation upon how God, the relationship between God and man.
Yeah.
How God, God had faith in Saul that he could do the job, and if he didn't, he wouldn't have made him king.
Right. Okay. Yeah. There was at least potential it could have been done.
Sure. So and then it all comes back technically upon us. Saul didn't deliver. Saul.
Well, look at it this way. Our lives. Every piece of our lives, all of our relationships, all of our experiences, all of our money, all of our successes, all of our failures, all those things are to be an offering to God. However, if God comes along and says, this is what you're going to be, and then he's just going to automatically make that happen, is that an offering? You're not giving anything. You have nothing to offer. If Parker says, hey, I'm going to preach on Sunday, and I write the sermon for him, it's not his sermon, it's mine. He's just saying it, and that's not the same thing. And I think so that's what God said is, Saul, I want you to be successful as king. So here's your opportunity. Well, looking back on it, that probably didn't work out the way we wanted it to.
And I think what else is this whole passage is actually very interesting when you read it. And this is one. Again, I mentioned I actually opened up the episode today talking about how I struggle to read some of these books just because they're dry. They're nothing like the New Testament, where it is. I mean, we are just getting command and law, and I mean, those are the good. That's the good stuff of like how to life changing and how to lead a Christian life and everything like that. Full of great stuff in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, we learn so much more about how God operates because, as I mentioned, Saul actually tried doing what in his eyes was a good thing. He took the nicest animals of the land that God told him to destroy, and he said, "I will sacrifice these to my God." Okay, but that is not what God asked. That is not what he told him to do. He told him kill everything. I mean, just wipe it all out.
Which we could look at that and say, "Gosh, we're kind of looking at semantics here." It's like, yeah.
But God is so This is before grace. Grace didn't. I mean,
yeah, that's an important thing to know.
And so this passage is explaining to us how God operates. If you don't do it right, well then, boom. This is actually the perfect example of kind of what sin is. We talked about on Wednesday night. How sin is, the definition is missing the mark. Okay, and how and we use Don used an analogy of like the archer and everything else, but in these passages, we find more. It's just so amazing.
Well, think about shooting a basketball. I'm here. I shoot the basketball. When it misses, I regret that. I wish it would have went in. I think that's where God's at here. You know, I had this destination for Saul. I kind of wish he had gotten there, but he didn't, and I regret that.
Yeah.
And now, one of the things that's interesting about this story, though, is you're in 1 Samuel 15. Well, wait till you turn over 2 chapters to the guy you're going to meet in 1 Samuel 17. That's where you run into a guy named David, and he's standing up against a guy named Goliath. And it's just very interesting how you look at David. I think David actually made worse mistakes than Saul did. I mean, if you look at that mistake he made there, you know, he was trying to sacrifice, and he's like, I wanted to give you the best, and we're all going, all right, that may not have been what he was told to do, but I see where he was coming from.
Yeah. I mean, we can see how, but this is how I mentioned the example of grace.
Yeah.
Like this is us. We are like in this analogy. If we did not have grace, if we were still back in the day and age where God was cut and dry, where God says, I regret putting any faith in that person because And Saul thought he was probably trying to do the right thing. Okay?
And even Saul was probably going, man, I'm sorry.
Aren't you being a little harsh?
Yeah, right.
But actually, that's not how Saul responds. Actually, Saul responds, he was like, you're right, I did, and Samuel then confronts Saul. He says, hey, the Lord came to me last night, and he said that he doesn't think you're fit to be king because he heard that you sacrificed animals, and that's not what he commanded you to do. And Saul was like, you're right, I've sinned against the Lord, I'm done. And he just walks away.
Yeah, he does. Like, I'm out. Yeah.
It's so interesting.
But it's fascinating, though, so he has this experience. So David, 2 chapters later, goes on, and Saul immediately spends how many chapters trying to kill David? A bunch of chapters. But eventually, David does things like with Bathsheba, and he actually goes and fights with the Philistines for a while, and he acts like a crazy man at one point. I mean, he does all kind of weird stuff. And but one thing that David always did, and we can make the argument that Saul did, but for some reason it didn't work, is David was always a man after God's own heart. David, the guy who did these terrible things, also wrote Psalm 23. So one of the most famous passages in the Bible. So it's I think it might have to do more with what's going on inside of the person than outside, because God is always more concerned with what's going on in the inside. It's amazing how much He will concede in order to arrange for you to have the internal experience that's going to bring you around. And one of the things about Saul's story that's so interesting, and I don't remember the name of the village, but Saul got his start when these foreigners decided, we're going to come into this village and we're going to wipe it out. And they said, well, let's make peace. And the guy said, okay, but we get to gouge out everybody's right eye. And they're like, well, we don't really have a choice. And so at that point, Saul hears about it. And Saul runs down and says, this ain't happening. He gets an army together and he goes over and he wipes everybody out. Just without mercy. And it's a little village, I can't remember the name of it. But anyways, far later in the book of Samuel, after Saul is dead, everybody abandoned Saul, everybody hated Saul, but one group of people came to get Saul's body down and bury it, and it was the people of that village where he started, because they remembered what Saul did for them. and it was it's like a full circle. So that village was
okay.
What's the name of the village?
I don't got the name of the village, but well, hold on.
Yeah. But it's anyways. But it was all about full circle because those people remembered. You know, Saul may have had his problems, but look at my right eye, I still have.
Yeah.
So
right here's two of the groups that we were talking about right here.
Yeah. The Amalekites and them, and that's they're the ones after Saul dies much later. I'll have to come back here. The Ammonites. Anyways, he basically demands a king. Here we go. This because and it's interesting that when God anointed David to be king, he immediately the first thing he does he goes and fights Goliath. Well, when God anointed Saul to be king, the first thing he went out was to save this village.
All right, here's Tim's looking for that actually.
Yeah.
Here's where this whole thing started. This whole discussion. This whole. I guess I started figuring out a scripture. I learned a little bit more about God. It all came together because of me just sitting down and reading a little bit about this book.
Yeah.
Like, there is so much to be held in here.
Yeah, go ahead. It's Jabesh Gilead. That's the name of the town.
There we go. Mm-hmm. But, and again, I mean, I would one day wish to be able to be like please. Tim and be like, hey, well, Saul, before then, actually, here's the real story, and this village, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I would like to, that's my goal in life, actually, is to be able to know it, just know it in my head and possess that. And again, Tim did go to college for some of that stuff, okay?
And seminary, all that.
Yeah, all that stuff, all that jazz. But, I think how awesome, and I was listening to a podcast, actually, and I think, and this is weird, I'm kind of changing direction a little bit.
That's all right.
But, it says, in the day and age where we're living in, we need more faithful men than we do rule-following men. Like, we need, I agree more faithful men, more,
we need more believers and less Pharisees.
Yes, more people who are, I guess, going to figure it out themselves. Figure it out, know it, follow it. And I think that is what we lack, a lot of us. And I mean, we are actually blessed to have a pastor who can do that, who has the ability to know what the book is and know stories in the book, because there's a lot of people who have this same kind of position who...
Yeah, that's what we should do sometime is I should challenge the congregation in Bible trivia.
Yeah. But it's just that's a thing that is missed. I think that that's something that we all need to start focusing up a little bit more on. Mm-hmm.
And that's what I found during a lot of the terrible times in my life, which there have been a number of those, is that it was the grounding in the Word that got me through, because you go back and you read about, people are going to hate you and people are going to be mad and all that stuff, but there's always the Jabesh Gilead silly cities out there to say, you know what, yeah, you probably screwed some stuff up, but we're better today because of what you gave us. And that's what they did for Saul. And that's why they went to get his body down after he was dead, was because they remembered, and they had the physical reminder right there, literally right there on their face, to say, we know what you did good. We know what you did that was good. And we appreciate you in spite of your flaws. And I think a lot of times we would all be better off if we could appreciate people despite their flaws, and be able to see the good that people are doing and the good that they can contribute, because there's a lot of people out there who feel very outside of what's happening, and that's not healthy. It's not a good thing. And I think that's what Saul eventually got to. He was so desperate to be accepted by God that he said, I know what I'll do. I know I'm supposed to kill all this stuff, but I'm going to make an offering, because then he's going to be super happy. And God was like, yeah, thanks, but no, that's not what I was looking for. So sometimes we work too hard to be accepted when God's like, no, I'd really rather you just kind of listen to what I tell you to do and not get so hung up on going the second mile, I guess. So.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're at.
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously a good motto for life throughout, no matter what period of the world or era we're in. But we've lost a kind of a group of people that possess that mentality. And I think that's something that would be very beneficial to have coming back.
And the reason that we should do that, let's go full circle here, ready?
Full circle, here we go.
Here we go. The reason that we do that is because God don't make no mistakes.
There we go. Wow.
See that?
Somehow
that's how you become a professional YouTuber right there, is to be able to do things like that.
Yeah, go a million one different directions, but as long as you end
where you started, you got it. So.
There you go. Wow.
All right, well, on that extremely profound note, thanks for joining us for this episode of the Raised Podcast, and we hope you all have a great week.
Hope you learned something.